Translate this, and I'll give you $10 million. The laugh that followed belonged to Dominic Russo, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and dread in the darkest corners of the city. He tossed a crumpled, age-worn leather journal onto the pristine white tablecloth. His top-tier linguists had already failed, sweating under his lethal gaze. It was a rhetorical joke, a cruel, arrogant taunt thrown at the terrified room. But the shy waitress with downcast eyes, gripping a silver water pitcher, didn't flinch. She leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper, and read the impossible script. The room went dead silent. To survive in a city that thrived on the destruction of the weak, Amelia Reed had mastered the art of being entirely invisible. At 24, she was a ghost in a pressed black uniform and a starched white apron, navigating the opulent, dimly lit floors of the Sterling. Located in the heart of Manhattan's elite district, the Sterling was not just a restaurant, it was a sanctuary for the untouchables. Mayors dined here. Wall Street titans bled their corporate rivals dry over plates of Wagyu beef here. And more discreetly, the men who controlled the city's underworld signed away lives over crystal glasses of imported scotch. Amelia preferred the background. She kept her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, unremarkable bun. She wore no makeup, spoke only when spoken to, and perfected a gaze that was perpetually aimed at the floorboards or the rims of the glasses she refilled. Her shyness wasn't just a personality trait, it was a finely tuned defense mechanism. But behind those quiet, hazel eyes was a mind that never stopped analyzing. Amelia had inherited a devastatingly rare gift from her late father, an erratic but brilliant cryptography professor who had dragged her across Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean during her childhood. She possessed an eidetic memory for linguistics. She didn't just learn languages. She absorbed their syntax, their slang, their deeply buried regional dialects. She spoke 8 languages fluently and could read a dozen more, including dead ciphers that baffled modern software. It was a useless skill for a waitress trying to pay off a mountain of inherited medical debt, but she kept the knowledge locked away in her mind, a secret sanctuary she retreated to when the real world became too loud. Tonight, the real world was deafening. The air in the private sapphire dining room was thick with an unnatural, suffocating tension. The waitstaff had drawn straws in the kitchen to see who would take the table, and Amelia, notoriously unlucky, had pulled the short end. Seated at the head of the heavy mahogany table was Dominic Russo. He was the newly ascended head of the Russo Syndicate, a man who had taken control of his family's empire with a ruthless efficiency that left the criminal underworld reeling. Dominic was terrifyingly composed. Broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and possessing a sharp, aristocratic jawline, he looked more like a ruthless hedge fund manager than a mob boss. But it was his eyes, pitch black, cold and predatory, that gave him away. Flanking him were his 2 right-hand men, Silas and Gabriel, heavy-set enforcers whose tailored jackets poorly hid the holstered weapons at their sides. Across from Dominic sat a faction of Eastern European businessmen, led by a man named Constantine. Constantine was a notorious arms dealer who operated through a web of shell companies, officially registered under the Valerius private logistics firm, a real, heavily guarded entity known to government agencies, but entirely untouchable. The meeting was supposed to be a merger, a finalization of supply routes through the eastern seaboard. Amelia stood in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the silk-lined wallpaper, holding a silver tray with a fresh decanter of water. She regulated her breathing, trying to make herself small as the deep, rumbling voices of the men echoed around her. "We agreed on a 20% cut, Constantine," Dominic's voice sliced through the room. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute authority. "I don't renegotiate after the ink is dry." Constantine smiled, a slick, oily expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The landscape changes, Mr. Russo. The local authorities have increased border patrols. Our risk is higher. Therefore, our price must reflect the current climate." Amelia watched the subtle shifts in body language. Gabriel shifted his weight. Silas let his hand rest casually on his thigh, inches from his jacket. Dominic simply stared at Constantine, tapping a heavy gold ring against the mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. I don't care about your risks, Dominic finally said, his tone dropping an octave. I care about the supply line. Which is why, Constantine replied smoothly, reaching into his breast pocket, I brought the new manifest. The complete routes, the updated ledger, and the revised terms, written of course in the old ledger code. He slid a small, heavily worn leather journal across the table. It stopped exactly inches from Dominic's hands. Amelia felt a strange prickle at the back of her neck. She recognized the look of the book. It wasn't just old. It looked deliberately obscured. Dominic didn't touch it. He gestured to a small, nervous man sitting at the far end of the table. Arthur, read it. Arthur, the Russo family's top retained linguist and legal translator, scrambled forward. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin. He adjusted his glasses, carefully opening the frail pages of the journal. Amelia stepped forward silently, fulfilling her duty. She moved to the table, uncorking the water decanter to refill Constantine's glass, keeping her eyes averted, but naturally letting her peripheral vision sweep across the open pages of the journal. Her breath hitched slightly. The text was chaotic. To an untrained eye, it looked like random scratchings, but Amelia's mind immediately began categorizing the shapes. It wasn't standard Cyrillic. It was a bastardized blend of an archaic Corsican dialect mixed with Soviet-era Gulag shorthand, a specific hyper-regional cipher used only by high-ranking intelligence officers during the Cold War. Her father had once spent a year trying to crack a letter written in a similar code. She finished pouring the water, stepping back into the shadows of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silence in the sapphire room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. All eyes were on Arthur. The translator was trembling visibly now. He turned a page, then turned it back, his face draining of color. "Well?" Dominic asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "What are the revised terms, Arthur?" "Mr. Russo, I..." Arthur stammered, pulling a magnifying loupe from his pocket and squinting at the page. "This isn't standard Russian. It's not Chechen. It's not Albanian. It appears to be an encrypted cipher, mixed with some sort of localized dialect. There are symbols here that don't belong to any modern alphabet." Constantine leaned back in his chair, a smug look crossing his features. "It is an insurance policy, Dominic. Only my inner circle can read the old ledger. You can take the journal to your best analysts. It will take them weeks to decode it. By then, the shipment will be secured and you will agree to my terms. 25%, non-negotiable." Dominic's jaw tightened. The disrespect was palpable. In his world, a lack of transparency was a declaration of war. He stood up slowly, towering over the table. He walked over to Arthur, who shrank back into his chair, terrified. Dominic picked up the journal, staring down at the jagged, inky scrawls. "Weeks?" Dominic murmured, turning to look at Constantine. "You think I have weeks to play games with you?" "It is not a game," Constantine replied, though his voice wavered slightly under Dominic's intense glare. "It is business." Dominic threw the journal back onto the center of the table with a loud smack that made Amelia flinch in her corner. He turned to Arthur, his eyes blazing with a suppressed fury. "You are supposedly the best linguist on the eastern seaboard, Arthur. I pay you $250,000 a year to ensure I am never blind in a room. Read the damn book." "I can't," Arthur squeaked, panic overtaking him. "It's gibberish. It's a dead language wrapped in a numerical code. Without a key, it's impossible. It's gibberish, sir." Dominic let out a harsh, barking laugh. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a predator realizing it was being caged. He paced the length of the table, his hands running through his dark hair. The sheer audacity of Constantine handing him an unreadable contract in his own city was an insult that demanded blood. He stopped, placing his hands flat on the table, leaning in close to Constantine. "You bring me gibberish," Dominic said, his voice ringing through the silent room. "You bring me a puzzle box and expect me to pay a premium for it." He stood up, throwing his arms wide, addressing the entire room in a burst of dark, theatrical arrogance. "Is there anyone in this godforsaken city who isn't utterly useless?" Dominic yelled, his voice echoing off the silk walls. He pointed at the leather book. "I swear to God, translate this, and I'll give you $10 million right now. $10 million to the first person who can read this absolute garbage." He laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound directed at Arthur, who was practically weeping into his napkin, and at Constantine, who looked suddenly nervous. In the corner of the room, Amelia froze. $10 million. The number echoed in her mind. $10 million was freedom. It was the end of the crushing debt left by her father's cancer treatments. It was the end of hiding from debt collectors, the end of living in a rat-infested studio apartment in Queens, the end of being invisible. She looked at the book lying open on the table. From her angle, she could see the top paragraph of the right-hand page. It wasn't a supply route manifest. Her eyes scanned the harsh symbols. Her brain effortlessly translated the Corsican root words, cross-referencing them with the Gulag shorthand. Route, block, port, execution. It wasn't a contract at all. Amelia's heart hammered so hard she felt physically sick. She was breaking the cardinal rule of the sterling. Never engage, never speak, never exist. But the knowledge burned in her throat. If Dominic Russo took that book home and let his analysts spend weeks decoding it, he would be dead before the weekend. She didn't make a conscious decision to move. Her body simply acted on a terrifying, desperate impulse. Amelia stepped out of the shadows. Her soft, rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the thick carpet, but as she stepped into the dim light of the chandelier, she suddenly became the focal point of the room. She walked slowly towards the table, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the silver water pitcher to her chest like a shield. Gabriel, Dominic's underboss, instantly stepped in front of her, his hand diving into his jacket. "Whoa, sweetheart. Back to the kitchen. You don't belong here." Amelia stopped. She looked up, past the massive enforcer, straight into the dark, stormy eyes of Dominic Russo. He was looking at her as if she were a hallucination, an insignificant bug that had wandered onto his battlefield. "Excuse me," Amelia whispered. Her voice was incredibly soft, husky from disuse, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried perfectly. Dominic narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" he snapped, his patience entirely evaporated. Amelia swallowed hard. She pointed a shaking finger toward the leather journal on the table. "I can read it," she said. For 3 agonizing seconds, the sapphire room existed in a vacuum. Constantine blinked, his smug expression freezing into a mask of utter confusion. Arthur, the highly paid linguist, stared at Amelia with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Then Dominic Russo let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "Is this a joke? Because if it is, sweetheart, I promise you, you don't want to play." "It's not a joke," Amelia said, her voice shaking, but her gaze remaining locked on Dominic. The sheer intensity of the Mafia Boss's stare was enough to make a lesser person crumble, but Amelia forced herself to stand her ground. $10 million. Freedom. "You said $10 million. I can translate it." "Get her out of here," Constantine suddenly barked, his face flushing red. "This is an insult. A waitress? You let the hired help interrupt our business?" Dominic raised a single hand, silencing Constantine instantly. He didn't take his eyes off Amelia. He studied her, the cheap, sensible shoes, the worn fabric of her black uniform, the utter terror radiating from her small frame. Yet, despite the fear, she wasn't backing down. "Let her through, Gabriel," Dominic commanded softly. Gabriel hesitated, casting a suspicious glare at Amelia, before stepping aside. Amelia walked to the table. She could feel the heat radiating from the men, the smell of expensive cologne, tobacco, and cold sweat. She set her water pitcher down on a side cart. Her hands were shaking violently now. She reached out and gently pulled the worn leather journal toward her. Constantine abruptly stood up. "Dominic, this is a farce! I will not have my proprietary documents handled by a peasant." "Sit down, Constantine," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "before I have Silas nail your knees to the floor." Constantine slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes darting nervously between Amelia and the door. Amelia leaned over the book. Up close, the ink was faded, written in a hurried, aggressive hand. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second to access the linguistic architecture in her mind, the Corsican grammar structure, the Cyrillic phonetic replacements. She opened her eyes and began to read aloud. "It begins with a standard greeting, heavily localized," Amelia said, her voice growing slightly more confident as the familiar comfort of translation took over. "To the Brotherhood of the Old Port, the wolf has taken the bait." Arthur scoffed loudly. "She's making it up. That's not what that symbol means. It's—" "Quiet," Dominic snapped, leaning closer to Amelia. "Keep reading, every word." Amelia traced her finger along the second line. "The numbers here aren't cargo weights," she explained, pointing to a string of digits. "They are coordinates. And times. It says, the primary target." She paused, looking up at Dominic. "There is a specific symbol used here. It represents the head of a rival family. It means you, Mr. Russo." Dominic's face turned entirely impassive, a mask of stone. "Go on." "It reads, the primary target will accept the revised ledger. While he awaits translation, the strike will occur at Pier 44, tomorrow at midnight. The heavy weapons are secured in the Valerius Logistics shipping containers. Once the target is eliminated, the territory defaults to our control. Do not leave witnesses." The silence that followed was entirely different from the ones before. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of a graveyard. Amelia slowly pushed the book back towards the center of the table and took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of the incredible danger she had just thrust herself into. Constantine was pale as a ghost. Sweat poured down his face. She is lying. She is a plant. You set this up, Dominic," he stammered, his hand inching slowly toward his coat pocket. Dominic didn't look at Constantine. He didn't yell. He didn't even blink. He simply reached into his jacket, smoothly drew a silenced pistol, and without turning his head, fired a single shot. Pfft. The sound was muffled, like a heavy book hitting a carpet. Constantine slumped backward into his chair, a small, dark hole perfectly centered in his forehead. The two men who had accompanied Constantine leapt up, shouting, but Gabriel and Silas were already moving. In less than 3 seconds, a brutal, violently efficient scuffle ended, with both of Constantine's men pinned to the floor, disarmed and bleeding from heavy blows to the head. Amelia screamed, clapping her hands over her mouth, backing away until she hit the wall. Her chest heaved in pure, unadulterated panic. She had never seen a dead body. She had never seen a man murdered casually over dinner. Arthur, the linguist, fainted dead away, slipping out of his chair and crumpling under the table. Dominic calmly placed his weapon back into its holster. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes finally shifting back to Amelia. She was pressed against the silk wallpaper, trembling violently, tears of sheer terror welling in her eyes. He walked slowly around the table, stepping over the unconscious body of one of Constantine's men. He stopped just inches from Amelia. He was so close she could smell the mint on his breath and the gunpowder lingering in the air. He looked down at her, his dark eyes analyzing her with a terrifying intensity. He reached out, and Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, expecting a blow. Instead, she felt his large, warm hand gently cup her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of the violent rage that had just consumed the room. Amelia," she choked out, a tear spilling over her lashes and running down her cheek. Amelia Reed. Amelia Reed. Dominic repeated, tasting the name. He brushed a stray strand of blonde hair away from her face, his thumb lingering against her cheekbone. You just saved my life, Amelia Reed. I just translated it, she whispered, her voice cracking. Can I go now? Please, I won't say anything, eh? I swear. Dominic let out a soft, dark chuckle. He dropped his hand from her face and looked back at the carnage in the room. Go? Sweetheart, you just read a level 5 syndicate cipher like it was a children's book. You just witnessed me execute a high-ranking asset of the Petrov cartel, and, he paused, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips, I owe you $10 million. He turned back to her, his expression resolute and uncompromising. You aren't going anywhere, Dominic Russo said softly. You work for me now. Before Amelia could protest, before she could even process the reality of her new existence, Silas grabbed her arm with an iron grip. Time to go, Miss Reed, Silas grunted, as they dragged her out of the private dining room, past the terrified, frozen staff of the Sterling, and out into the cold Chicago night toward a waiting fleet of black SUVs. Amelia realized the devastating truth. She was no longer invisible. She had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so, she had sold her soul to the devil. And the devil always paid his debts. The transition from the blood-stained carpet of the Sterling to the sterile, pressurized cabin of a private Gulfstream jet happened in a blur of terrifying efficiency. Amelia hadn't spoken a word. She sat frozen in the plush leather seat, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring blankly out the window into the pitch-black sky. Silas and Gabriel sat near the front, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their weapons now fully visible. Dominic Russo sat directly across from her. He had shed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and a sprawling, intricate tattoo of a predatory bird masking his left wrist. He was drinking a glass of amber liquid, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He was studying her, dissecting her reactions. Drink this, Dominic commanded softly, leaning forward to place a glass of water on the small table between them. You're going into shock. Amelia didn't move. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was a fragile, hollow rasp. Where are you taking me? Away from Manhattan, Dominic replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of his drink. Constantine wasn't just a rogue arms dealer. He was a high-ranking lieutenant for the Petrov Syndicate. By tomorrow morning, every Russian hitman from Brighton Beach to Moscow will know that a waitress in a black uniform derailed a multi-million-dollar coup and got their boss killed. If I left you at that restaurant, you would be dead before the breakfast rush. Amelia's breath hitched. The reality of his words crashed over her like freezing water. I don't know anything. I just read the book. You promised. You said you owed me. I said I owed you $10 million, Miss Reed. I didn't say you were free to go. Dominic reached beside his seat and produced a sleek silver laptop. He opened it, typed rapidly for a few seconds, and turned the screen toward her. Amelia blinked, her tear-filled eyes struggling to focus on the illuminated screen. It was a banking portal, an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account name was an anagram of her mother's maiden name, a detail no one should have known. The balance read, $10 million. The debt is paid, Dominic stated, his voice devoid of emotion. The money is yours, completely untraceable, entirely secure. It's enough to clear the $500,000 you owe the oncology ward at Mount Sinai for your late father's treatments. It's enough to buy an island. But he paused, snapping the laptop shut with a sharp clack that made her jump. You can't spend it from a coffin. Amelia stared at the closed laptop, her mind short-circuiting. The money she had fantasized about, the freedom she had desperately craved, was sitting right in front of her. But it felt like ashes. She was traded one insurmountable debt for another. How do you know about my father's bills? She whispered, a new layer of dread settling in her stomach. Dominic leaned back, his gaze turning analytical. "I know everything, Amelia. I know your father was Professor David Reed, a brilliant but disgraced cryptographer who lost his tenure because of a gambling addiction. I know you spent your childhood dragged through the underbelly of Eastern Europe while he hid from loan sharks. I know you speak 8 languages, read dead ciphers, and have been hiding your genius behind a waitress apron because you're terrified of drawing attention to yourself." He leaned forward, the space between them suddenly feeling dangerously small. "You thought you were invisible, but brilliance like yours is never truly invisible. It just waits for the right moment to ignite." "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have an empire to protect, and I am currently blind," Dominic said, the ruthless Mafia boss re-emerging. "The Petrovs are making a massive play for my territory. They are using this archaic ledger code to bypass my digital surveillance. Arthur was an overpaid idiot. You, however, read that cipher as easily as reading a menu." "I won't work for a murderer," Amelia spat out, finding a sudden, desperate spark of defiance. Dominic's eyes darkened, a dangerous tempest brewing in his irises. "I didn't ask for your resume, Amelia, and I am not offering you a choice. I just handed you $10 million. In exchange, you belong to the Russo Syndicate until the Petrov threat is eradicated. You are my translator, my cipher, my weapon." Hours later, the jet touched down at a private airstrip, nestled deep within the snow-covered mountains of the Pacific Northwest. Amelia was escorted into the back of a heavily armored SUV and driven to a sprawling, high-tech fortress built into the side of a cliff. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Glass, steel, and concrete, surrounded by electrified fencing and armed patrols. She was led to a massive suite overlooking the darkened valley. The room was breathtakingly luxurious, filled with silk sheets, a roaring fireplace, and a mahogany bookshelf. But when Silas pulled the heavy oak door shut behind her, the unmistakable, heavy click of a deadbolt echoed through the silence. Amelia ran to the door, rattling the solid brass handle. It was locked from the outside. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass was thick, undoubtedly bulletproof, and the drop below was a sheer cliff face. She was a multimillionaire, and she was a prisoner in a golden cage. For 3 days, Amelia saw no one but a silent housekeeper who brought her meals. The isolation was maddening, designed to break her resolve. She paced the length of her suite, tracing the patterns in the Persian rugs, her mind racing with a million frantic plans of escape, none of which were viable. On the 4th morning, the heavy deadbolt clicked open. Silas stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the exit. "The boss wants you in the war room, now." Amelia didn't argue. She had changed out of her waitress uniform into a soft grey cashmere sweater and dark jeans that had been left in her closet, clothes that fit perfectly, another unsettling reminder of how closely Dominic had studied her. Silas led her down a labyrinth of sleek, minimalist hallways, descending 2 levels below ground into a state-of-the-art command center. The room was humming with the sound of servers. Banks of monitors covered the walls, displaying satellite feeds, financial tickers, and live surveillance of the estate. Dominic stood at the center of the room, leaning over a massive digital table. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble, yet he still radiated a terrifying, magnetic authority. Beside him stood Gabriel and a wiry, bespectacled man frantically typing on a tablet, whom Amelia later learned was Wyatt, the syndicate's lead tech engineer. Dominic looked up as she entered. His gaze swept over her, taking in the cashmere sweater and her pale, determined face. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a high-backed leather chair beside the table. Amelia walked forward, her heart pounding, and sat down. Dominic slid a thick file folder toward her. It was filled with dozens of photocopied pages, grainy photographs of handwritten notes, and intercepted physical mail. Since Constantine's death, the Petrovs have gone entirely analog, Dominic explained, his voice rough. No emails, no texts, no encrypted servers. They are moving millions of dollars in weapons and narcotics, and they are coordinating it all through physical couriers, using that localized ledger code. Wyatt's algorithms are useless against it. Wyatt scowled but didn't argue. It's a Frankenstein cipher, he muttered. No linguistic baseline. Amelia, Dominic said, leaning over her chair, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive cadence that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. I need you to break it. All of it. Amelia stared at the sprawling mess of documents. She could see the bloodstains on some of the pages. She knew exactly what translating these meant. She would be directly facilitating organized crime. She would be helping a monster dismantle other monsters. And if I refuse? She asked quietly, not looking up. Then the Petrovs wipe out my southern supply lines. Hundreds of my people die. And eventually they breach this compound and kill us both, Dominic stated bluntly. Your moral high ground is a luxury you can't afford right now, Amelia. We are in a war. Read the pages. Amelia closed her eyes. She thought of her father, how he used to treat ciphers as beautiful, intricate puzzles. He never used his gift for violence. But she was trapped. Survival was the only metric that mattered now. She opened her eyes, pulled a blank legal pad toward her, and picked up a pen. For the next 6 hours, the war room fell into a tense, awed silence. Amelia worked with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. Her mind slipped into a state of hyperfocus. She sorted the pages not by date, but by the subtle variations in the handwriting. This batch here, she said, her voice steady, pointing to a stack of letters. This isn't from the main Petrov family. The syntax is clumsy. It's a sub-faction in Miami. They are complaining about a delayed shipment of ghost guns. They say, she traced a line of harsh symbols. They say the northern hounds are sniffing too close to the port. Dominic looked at Gabriel. The feds are onto the Miami port. Shut it down. Reroute everything through Charleston. Gabriel nodded sharply and stepped away to make the call. Amelia moved to the next document. Hour after hour, she mapped out the Petrov syndicate's entire logistical nightmare. She became an oracle, decoding assassination plots, bribes paid to city officials, and stash house locations. Dominic watched her, entirely captivated. He had expected a terrified civilian. Instead, he was watching a prodigy dismantle an empire with a ballpoint pen. He found his gaze lingering on the delicate curve of her neck, the intense furrow of her brow, the way she chewed on her bottom lip when a sentence proved difficult. It was a dangerous distraction. Around midnight, Wyatt and Gabriel had left the room to execute the new orders. Only Silas remained, standing silently by the door. Amelia was staring at a specific, heavily encrypted letter. It had been found on the body of one of Konstantin's men. She had been staring at it for 20 minutes, her pen hovering over the paper. The color had completely drained from her face. Dominic noticed the shift immediately. He walked around the table, standing close behind her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Have you hit a wall?" "No," Amelia whispered. Her hand was shaking so badly she dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the glass table. It's not a wall. Read it to me, Amelia." She turned around in her chair, looking up at Dominic with wide, terrified eyes. The power dynamic in the room suddenly shifted. She held a secret that could shatter everything he had built. "This letter," she started, her voice barely audible. "It's written in the Petrov cipher. But the sentence structure, the idiomatic expressions used to describe the shipments, it's not Russian, it's not Corsican." Dominic frowned, his patience thinning. "Then what is it?" "It's Sicilian," Amelia said, swallowing hard. "Specifically, a dialect from Palermo. The cipher uses symbols, but whoever wrote this was translating their thoughts from deep, native Sicilian into the Petrov code." Dominic went entirely still. The Russo family was from Palermo. His father had insisted the inner circle speak the old dialect. The Petrovs were strictly Eastern European. They wouldn't know the nuances of Palermo slang. "What are you saying?" Dominic asked, his voice dangerously quiet, the air in the room dropping 10 degrees. Amelia looked down at the paper, then back up at the terrifying Mafia Boss. "I'm saying the Petrovs aren't outsmarting you on their own, Dominic. This letter is a schedule of your personal movements for the next month. Someone is feeding them your exact coordinates." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "You have a mole, and based on this dialect, it's someone in your absolute inner circle. Someone in this house." The silence in the underground war room was suffocating, heavy with the sudden metallic taste of betrayal. Dominic Russo did not shout. He did not flip the glass table or draw his weapon. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness washed over him. He stared at the translated letter in Amelia's trembling hand, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. "Palermo," Dominic repeated, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "Only 4 people in my entire syndicate speak the old Palermo dialect, fluently enough to translate complex logistics into a dead cipher. Me, my uncle in federal prison. Silas." He paused, his dark eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "And Gabriel." Amelia shrank back into her leather chair. She had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. "It's a linguistic fingerprint," she explained, her voice gaining a desperate, rapid cadence as she sought to justify her terrifying conclusion. "Everyone has an idiolect, a unique way they construct sentences. This writer uses a specific, archaic phrasing for delivery. They don't use the standard Italian consegna. They use a localized slang term that translates roughly to the feeding." Dominic's gaze snapped from the paper to Amelia, his mind rapidly processing the tactical nightmare. Gabriel was his underboss. He knew the security codes to the Pacific Northwest compound. He knew the routing numbers for the Russo family's primary offshore accounts at Credit Suisse. Most importantly, Gabriel was currently upstairs, coordinating the tactical response against the Petrovs based on the very information Amelia had just decoded. "He's adjusting our defenses to walk us right into a slaughter," Dominic said, realizing the trap. Before Amelia could respond, the heavy steel door of the war room hissed open. Silas stepped in, his massive frame tense, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. "Boss, Gabriel just ordered the perimeter guards to shift to the north ridge. He says Wyatt picked up thermal movement." "Wyatt isn't on the thermal monitors. He's tracing the Miami wire transfers," Dominic replied, his voice eerily calm. He reached under the glass table and pulled a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol from a hidden magnetic mount. He racked the slide with a sharp, terrifying clack. "Silas," Dominic ordered, not looking up as he checked the magazine. "Gabriel has sold us to the Petrovs. He's the mole." Silas froze. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock registered on the enforcer's heavily scarred face. Then the shock melted into a cold, professional fury. He didn't ask for proof. Dominic's word was absolute law. Silas drew his weapon. "Where do you want him?" "Alive," Dominic said, his eyes burning with a dark, violent promise. "I want to know how much my life was worth before I end his." But the trap had already been sprung. The lights in the war room suddenly flickered and died, plunging the underground bunker into total darkness. A second later, the dull red glow of the emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in a bloody, sinister light. Alarms began to blare, a high-pitched, rhythmic shrieking that rattled Amelia's teeth. "He cut the main power," Silas growled, moving swiftly to cover the doorway. "He knows we know." "Amelia, get under the table," Dominic commanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled beneath the heavy steel and glass structure, pulling her knees to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clamped her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Heavy, deliberate boots. "Dominic!" Gabriel's voice rang out, distorted by the concrete hallway. It lacked its usual deference, replaced by a sneering, arrogant confidence. It's over! The Petrovs just breached the south gate. You're boxed in. Come out. And I'll make it quick. You owe me that much after 10 years of playing your shadow." "You sold your soul for a discount, Gabriel," Dominic yelled back, his voice echoing with absolute authority, despite the red-lit chaos. He signaled Silas to flank the left side of the heavy steel door. "Constantine is dead. The Petrovs will cut your throat the second they take this compound." "Constantine was a middleman," Gabriel laughed harshly. "The Petrovs offered me the eastern seaboard. I'm not a shadow anymore, Dom." Bang, bang, bang! 3 deafening shots shattered the glass of the war room's observation window. Shards rained down on the floor. Amelia screamed, a sound swallowed by the deafening roar of Silas returning fire. The noise was apocalyptic in the enclosed space. Dominic moved with the terrifying speed of an apex predator. He didn't blind fire. He waited for a lull in Gabriel's reload, stepped out from cover, and fired twice. A heavy thud echoed from the corridor, followed by a wet, gargling groan. "Clear!" Silas shouted, stepping into the hallway, his weapon trained downward. Amelia kept her eyes squeezed shut until she felt a firm, warm hand grip her shoulder. She flinched violently, but the scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder told her it was Dominic. "It's over," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the violence that had just erupted. Amelia slowly opened her eyes and crawled out from under the table. She looked into the hallway. Gabriel was slumped against the concrete wall, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Dominic walked over to his former underboss, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. He didn't ask for apologies. He didn't ask for a final confession. "You should have learned Russian, Gabriel," Dominic whispered. "You might have survived the translation." Dominic raised his weapon and fired a single, final shot. The aftermath of Gabriel's betrayal was a masterclass in ruthless, terrifying efficiency. There were no police sirens, no flashing lights, no panicked 911 calls echoing through the rugged valleys of the Pacific Northwest. Within 3 hours, Dominic's loyalists had repelled the disorganized Petrov hit squad at the south gate. By dawn, the sprawling estate was functionally sterilized. Amelia sat wrapped in a heavy wool blanket in the fortified library on the top floor. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and faintly, irrevocably, of copper and bleach. Through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows, she watched the pale morning sun bleed over the snow-capped pines. Below, in the courtyard, a black, unmarked cleanup crew, operating with the chilling precision of a Garda-World Black Ops unit, was loading the last of the body bags into a refrigerated transport van. Gabriel was in one of them. Amelia shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. On the heavy mahogany desk in front of her sat her phone, displaying a secure login to a UBS Group AG private offshore banking portal. The screen glowed with the undeniable, life-altering balance: $10 million. Just 48 hours ago, her biggest fear had been the relentless collection calls from Mount Sinai Hospital regarding her late father's oncology bills, or the looming default on her Navient loans. She had been a ghost at the Sterling, pouring sparkling water for predators, hoping they wouldn't notice her frayed cuffs. Now, she was sitting in a mafia fortress, a multi-millionaire, having just orchestrated the tactical downfall of a Russian syndicate by translating a dead dialect. The heavy iron-wrought doors of the library creaked open. Amelia didn't jump. The paralyzing, rabbit-like fear that had defined her entire adult life had been entirely burned away in the crucible of the underground war room. She slowly turned her head. Dominic Rousseau walked in. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of the man seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. He had showered and changed into a fresh, tailored black suit, but the violent night had left its mark. Dark, bruising shadows sat beneath his eyes, and his knuckles were split and red. Yet he still moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He didn't speak immediately. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table, pouring 2 fingers of Macallan 25. He swallowed half of it in one go, the amber liquid burning down his throat, before he finally turned his dark, impenetrable gaze to her. Wyatt just finished scrubbing the servers, using a customized Palantir Ghost protocol, Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He confirmed the wire transfers. Gabrielle was paid $8 million through a shell corporation in the Caymans. He left the Southgate blind and fed my entire monthly schedule to the Petrovs. For $8 million, my underboss tried to butcher my family. Amelia stared at her phone, at the $10 million resting in her own account. You offered me $10 million just to read a book. And you, Dominic replied, stepping slowly towards the desk, proved to be the best investment I have made in my entire miserable life. He set his crystal glass down beside her phone. He leaned his hands flat on the mahogany wood, leaning over her. The proximity was intoxicating. Amelia could smell the sharp tang of the scotch on his breath, mixed with the expensive cedar of his cologne, and the faint, lingering metallic scent of gunpowder. I told you on the jet that you couldn't spend that money from a coffin, Amelia, Dominic said, his tone shifting from the cold detachment of a mob boss to something far more dangerous, far more intimate. The Petrov threat is neutralized. They are scrambling, leaderless. The war for now is won. You saved my life at the restaurant, and you saved my entire empire tonight. Amelia held his gaze. Her hazel eyes, usually cast downward in submission, were locked fiercely onto his pitch-black ones. Gabriel is dead. The mole is gone. Am I free to go, Dominic? The silence that stretched between them was heavy, thick with unspoken desires and the raw, electric charge of mutual survival. Dominic stood up straight, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her chair. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, black keycard, tossing it onto the desk next to the phone. A NetJets Bombardier Challenger 350 is sitting fueled on the tarmac at the private strip down the mountain, Dominic said smoothly, his eyes never leaving hers. That key card gets you past the gate. Silas will drive you himself. The $10 million is yours, clean, untaxed, untraceable. You can pay off Mount Sinai. You can buy a villa in Tuscany or a penthouse in Manhattan. I will provide a shadow security detail to ensure the Petrovs never get within 100 miles of you. You can disappear into a quiet, safe, beautiful life. And I swear on my life, Amelia, I will never look for you. Amelia looked at the black keycard. It was the exit door. It was the culmination of every desperate prayer she had whispered in her tiny, rat-infested queen's apartment. Freedom. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold plastic of the card. Dominic watched her, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He was a man who took what he wanted, a man who commanded thousands. Yet he was entirely paralyzed by the delicate movement of her hand. But you and I both know you don't want to be invisible anymore, Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a seductive, lethal whisper. Do you, Amelia? She froze. I watched you down in that war room, he continued, stepping around the desk, invading her personal space until his thighs brushed against the armrest of her chair. I watched you slip into that cipher like it was a second skin. You didn't just survive tonight. You thrived in it. Your father dragged you through the dirt of the underworld, and you spent your whole life trying to wash it off. But it's in your blood. You have a beautiful, terrifying, brilliant mind. If you take that jet, you will spend the rest of your life suffocating in a world full of ordinary people, pretending you don't know how to play God. Amelia's breath hitched. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. He was tearing down the walls of her psyche with terrifying precision. He was offering her the one thing she had never been allowed to have. Power. What are you offering me, Dominic? She asked, her voice shedding its last trace of a tremor, emerging cool and sharp. A throne, Dominic answered without a second of hesitation. He reached down, his large, calloused hand gently gripping her chin, tilting her face up. His thumb brushed over her lower lip. It was a fiercely possessive touch. "I am surrounded by men with guns, Amelia. I have enforcers, I have hitters, I have tech analysts. But I need a partner, someone who can see the traps before they are set. You will be my chief intelligence officer. You will rewrite my entire syndicate's encryption protocols. You will stand by my side, not behind me. And I promise you." He leaned in, his lips hovering mere inches from hers. "No one in this world will ever dare look past you again." Amelia looked down at the desk, the keycard, the phone with the 10 million, and finally the worn leather journal that had started it all. It was a symbol of violence, blood, and crime. But it was also the key that had unlocked her cage. If she left, she would be rich, but she would always be looking over her shoulder. If she stayed, she would be walking into the fire, but she would be the one controlling the flames. Slowly, deliberately, Amelia pushed the black NetJet's keycard back across the desk, away from her. She reached up and placed her hand over the one Dominic had resting on her jaw. Her skin was warm against his cold knuckles. "If I stay," Amelia said, a small, dangerous smile curving her lips, "I'm going to need a new wardrobe. I refuse to rule a syndicate in cashmere sweaters you bought for your ex-girlfriends." And she paused, her eyes flashing with a brilliant, dark light. "My rate for translations just went up. We split the Eastern Seaboard supply lines 50-50. Dominic stared at her for a fraction of a second, utterly stunned by her audacity. Then a deep, genuine laugh erupted from his chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. He didn't shake her hand. Instead, he leaned down and captured her lips in a bruising, hungry kiss, tasting of scotch and adrenaline. Amelia kissed him back, her hands tangling in his dark hair, entirely surrendering to the chaotic, violent pull of the man who had finally seen her. The contract wasn't signed in ink, it was sealed in blood, ambition, and the unbreakable silence of the underworld. The invisible waitress was dead. The Queen had arrived. The evolution of Amelia Reed from a terrified, invisible waitress to the most feared intelligence asset in the underworld is a testament to the intoxicating allure of power. The $10 million joke spun in the Sapphire Room catalyzed a chain of events that shattered her quiet existence, forcing her to weaponize the very intellect she had spent her life hiding. In the end, Amelia realized that true safety wasn't found in being unnoticed. It was found in being indispensable. By deciphering the violent language of Dominic Rousseau's world, she didn't just earn her freedom. She claimed an empire. She traded a life of mundane submission for a reign of